Paul and Mahomet both talked about historical figures, but one of them was exceptionally careful, while the other was extraordinarily sloppy. Care to guess which is which? In Surah 18, Allah tells us that Dhul Qarnayn, usually identified as Alexander the Great, traveled so far west, he found the place where the sun sets. Not only can I guarantee that Alexander the Great never found the place where the sun sets, we know that this was a popular story during Muhammad's lifetime. The story was even circulating in a Syriac work titled The Glorious Deeds of Alexander towards the end of Muhammad's life. Earlier in Surah 18, we read about the Companions of the Cave, a group of people who supposedly went to sleep in a cave and woke up 300 years later. This myth goes back to Bishop Stephen of Ephesus around the middle of the 5th century. It seems that Muhammad simply took the stories that were popular during his lifetime, gave them an Islamic twist, and included them in the Quran. What's interesting is that even the pagans of Mecca were better at recognizing fiction than Muhammad was. In Surah 6, verse 25, Allah says to Muhammad, "When they come to you to argue with you, the unbelievers say, 'These are nothing but fables of the men of old.'" Here we have pagans saying, "Muhammad, you don't really believe these stories, do you?" So we know that Muhammad was extremely sloppy and gullible when it came to stories about historical figures, which means that there's no way we can accept him as a reliable source of information about Jesus. Paul, by contrast, was far more careful in transmitting stories. As a Pharisee, Paul was obsessed with preserving and passing on authoritative tradition. Paul describes his life as a Pharisee by saying, "I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions." Paul's obsession with tradition doesn't go away when he becomes a Christian. He just changes the source of authority. As a Pharisee, he would have passed on traditions he obtained from respected rabbis. As a Christian, he passed on traditions he obtained from Jesus' apostles. When we read what Paul says about Jesus, we're reading the words of a man who was trained all of his life to carefully and zealously preserve and pass on authoritative tradition from respected sources. He's the polar opposite of Muhammad, one of whose contemporaries said of him in Ibn Ishaq, page 243, "Muhammad is all ears. If anyone tells him anything, he believes it." A guy who has a reputation for believing anything anyone tells him is not the sort of guy you want telling you what to believe about the most important man in history. Historians have a variety of tools that can help us learn about historical figures. Since Paul and Muhammad both made claims about Jesus, the tools of the historian can help us decide whom to trust. When Muhammad preached in Arabia, there weren't a lot of historians around, and the early Muslim community didn't know much about first century Christianity. So in this atmosphere of ignorance, Muhammad could say whatever he wanted to say about Jesus, and his followers wouldn't know that he was wrong. Muhammad could say, for instance, as he does in Surah 4, verse 157 of the Quran, that Jesus wasn't killed and wasn't crucified. Muhammad could say that Jesus claimed to be nothing but a prophet and that Jesus' disciples were Muslims. 7th century Arab Muslims wouldn't know any better, and even if they had, it wasn't exactly safe to question Muhammad's teachings. But we're not in that position. We have tons of ancient sources. We have a never-ending supply of historical Jesus scholars, and we have the freedom to go where the evidence points. And when we apply the historical method and the tools of textual criticism to the ancient records, we find that the Muslim view of Jesus as a man who claimed to be nothing but a prophet, who was never killed, who never rose from the dead, and whose followers were Muslims. This view reflects the historical Jesus about as much as a Huffington Post article claiming that Muhammad was a world-class feminist reflects the historical Muhammad. But Paul's claims about Jesus line up perfectly with everything we can learn about Jesus historically. And because Paul was a contemporary of Jesus and knew Jesus' original apostles, if Paul had preached a non-historical Jesus, he would have been condemned by the early church and exposed as a false teacher. The reason he wasn't condemned and exposed was that the Jesus preached by Paul was the same Jesus who walked along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, who performed miracles, who made claims that no mere prophet should ever make, who died on the cross for sins, and who rose from the dead. The Islamic Jesus is a kind of Frankenstein monster pieced together from 7th century Arabian fables, filtered through Muhammad's 7th century Arabian theology, a theology that was only one step removed from its pagan roots. If you've ever wondered why there are Christian historical Jesus scholars, Jewish historical Jesus scholars, atheist historical Jesus scholars, and agnostic historical Jesus scholars, but no Muslim historical Jesus scholars, it's because Muslims are bound by the methods and ideas of Muhammad, the world's greatest authority on how not to do history. As human beings, we're inevitably influenced by the culture we grow up in. But when someone grows up in a pagan culture and suddenly claims to be receiving revelations from God, we'd better not see the imprint of pagan theology on those revelations. During the time of the judges and the kings of ancient Israel, the Jews often turned to pagan gods and pagan forms of worship. But by the 1st century AD, the time of Jesus and Paul, the Jews were done flirting with false gods. They had utter contempt for the beliefs and practices of the pagans. The Apostle Paul had a strict Jewish upbringing and would have therefore shared the general Jewish view of polytheism. But Paul was no ordinary Jew. He was a Pharisee, a member of the most rigid sect, and even among Pharisees, Paul was considered especially zealous. Why is this relevant? Well, there are Muslims who try to explain the origin of Christianity by claiming that Paul was influenced by Greco-Roman polytheists. Paul was so mesmerized by all of the gods of the pagans that he deified Jesus as a form of compromise. And that might make sense to certain people, assuming they know absolutely nothing about the Apostle Paul, especially the fact that he would have rather died 100,000 horrible bloody deaths than compromise his worship of the one true God. Paul became a Christian because he met Jesus, and his encounter with Jesus caused him to re-examine Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, ultimately convincing him that the law and the prophets were all looking forward to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. There's no room in Paul's reasoning for even a hint of pagan influence. But there was no shortage of pagan influence on Muhammad. For instance, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, which is saturated with paganism and idolatry. Before Muhammad conquered Mecca, the pagans would take a pilgrimage to Mecca, where they would visit the Kaaba and walk around it 7 times. They walked 7 circles around the Kaaba to honor the 7 planetary deities which they believed circled the earth. They would kiss the black stone, one of the many stones in the ancient Near East that received worship. They would run back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa. Remind me, What do Muslims do when they take the pilgrimage to Mecca? They visit the Kaaba and walk around it 7 times, just like the pagans did. They kiss the black stone, just like the pagans did. They run back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa, just like the pagans did. But let me guess, if it looks like paganism and walks like paganism and talks like paganism, it must be pure monotheism in disguise, right?